I'm Rory Cellan-Jones. I'm the author of Always On, and this is a bit of an experiment. The first, I hope, of a series of little chats about themes from the book. And this one has been inspired by Simon Rockman, computer industry, technology, journalism veteran, has been at all sorts of top publications, is now heavily involved in spreading the 5G gospel. But he tweeted taking issue with something in the book, and his theme was why I was wrong about why the iPhone won. About two things: why Apple's iPhone came to dominate the industry or change the whole mood of the industry, and whether it was the first smartphone. So that's what's inspired this. And I've also invited along Ben Wood from CCS Insight, the man with the biggest collection of mobile phones ever, the geekiest geek there is about mobile, and somebody who actually proofread the book. That's how patient he is. So definitely a friend of Always On. And just a quick reminder, there will be a certain amount of advertising in this short video session. You can get this at all good booksellers and at Amazon.com, I believe, a small online retailer. Simon,
and you can listen to it as well, Rory, which I've enjoyed doing following proofreading it, and it's great to hear you read it. It gave me a whole new spin on the book.
Funny you should say that. Massively advertising. I've managed to get up on my Amazon Fire TV Audible playing my book, but you don't worry, you're not going to have to listen during this. Simon, let's get cracking. So what just lay out first of all what your kind of objection, kind of point you were trying to make in that tweet.
It's more Apple didn't win. It was the operators held back all the other handset manufacturers and gave Apple alone a free run at the market.
So the first chapter of the book, the first proper chapter, describes the launch of the iPhone in January 2007, Steve Jobs' extraordinary keynote there. It then goes on in the following chapter to outline that by 2011, Apple, if it hadn't won the market, had won the lion's share of the profits in the industry and had dispatched Nokia and BlackBerry in particular into the outer darkness. And you're saying that was nothing to do with Apple, that was all to do with the operators.
Very heavily, yes. More than the majority of the case. Yes, the other handset manufacturers, and I was at Motorola at the time, made a complete Pig Zero software. So what killed Motorola was its inability to manage software tasks, and Nokia eventually went down the same spiral, though Nokia started off actually being quite good at software. But if my strongest contention is, if any other manufacturer had gone to AT&T and then O2 with an identical phone to the iPhone, it would never have been accepted. So one of the things the iPhone had was visual voicemail. Now, Motorola had tried that with Map. Motorola had a phone called Map that did visual voicemail. The operators wouldn't take it. They weren't prepared to re-engineer their voicemail system for it. They were prepared to do that for Apple.
And why were the operators?
Because the operators lived in a state of war with their suppliers. Everything was a really confrontational negotiation. So we go into, and I was also at Sony Ericsson, so this is probably a better Sony Ericsson example. We'd go into an operator and say, here's our $80 handset. And I'd take it apart and say, oh, it's that camera, that CPU. This costs you $62 to make. And we'd say, well, maybe it does, but we want to sell it to you for $80. They'd say, we'll give you $61 for it, and we'll buy 3 million. And you're saying you want us to lose $3 million on the sale? Oh, yes, because that way you'll get the volume up, and then you can go and sell it to somebody else at $80, and you can more than make what you lose from us out of the enhanced margin. And both Motorola and Sony Ericsson, we did deals like that. But it was a really nasty, contentious relationship. So
why was their relationship with Apple different when they saw the iPhone, or even before the official unveiling? they were incredibly enthusiastic. Are you saying it was
because Apple wasn't part of the game? Apple wasn't a threat. Apple was an outsider. They could give Apple a bit of space in order to teach, if you're American, the Kyocera, if you're European, Nokia, a lesson by bringing somebody else in. It was to bring in somebody else in order to beat up the existing suppliers.
So, is it not the case that what Apple unveiled in that January 2007 was visually arresting, had a level of excitement to it that the other mobile phone operators, makers, had failed to provide, had failed to inspire consumers?
Because when the operators had things, Ericsson had a phone called Pamela. Actually, Ben, have you got a Pamela?
I think we probably do if it's one of the Symbian ones, powered ones, but
actually it might have predated Symbian. So Ericsson had Pamela, Ericsson, Motorola had the 925. There were lots of smartphones, and very often 3G smartphones, things with better specs than the iPhones, and the operators just wouldn't take them. And then so Pamela was a concept. There were lots of concepts where operators went into the operators and said, here's the future of mobile phones. And the operators would say, well, we've got our consumer segmentation, so it's the busy mother, or it's the executive, or it's the fashionable teen, and here's our spec for all the people in our consumer segmentation. And if you don't make a phone that fits into our slots, we're not buying it. And one of the things was price point. And Apple managed to sell in a $400, or was it $300 at launch? Was it $300 or $400 at launch?
It was $499 at launch, and then they dropped the price.
Yeah. 2G phone. Now that was so far off the consumer segmentation. Nobody else could have sold a 2G phone at that price into an operator, but the operators took it from them. And it side-loaded music. Well, the operators hated other people's portals. Remember, this was the days of Java stores where the operators were taking 80% of the revenue. And when Nokia launched Ovi, the operators conspired to kill Ovi. They weren't.
So I think we need to break down some of the points you've made now. So
exactly. I was going to bring Ben in. Ben, am I right in thinking you do not quite share Simon's interpretation of the foolish stroke evil operators handing the market on a plate to Apple?
I don't, although I do think there's truth in some of the things that Simon said. So from my perspective, I think your premise, and as you outline it in the book, was that Apple created something unlike anything we'd seen. So even making comparisons to the devices that are in the market and some of these concept devices that Simon's talked about, I would contend that actually what Apple had done was completely reimagined the market. They took a compute power device and basically shrunk it down and put it in your pocket. So it was a massive disruption. And at the time, I won't rewrite history and say that I immediately saw the iPhone and thought this is a game changer. Many of the objections that Simon has suggested, like it's only 2G, it doesn't support the multimedia messaging service, which was the operator's extremely expensive picture messaging service, and various other things it did. And there's no subsidy allowed, which was another key factor in building phone sales at that time. Looked as though there was no way this product was going to succeed. But once you got it in your hand, whether it was you, as you so eloquently describe in the book, this serendipitous moment with Phil Schiller letting you touch the Jesus phone, and or whether it was actually real consumers. So I had someone queue up outside an AT&T store and air freight it over to me, and I think I had one of the first ones in the UK. All of a sudden you realize this was a game changer. And let's not forget, Nokia had 40% market share. Operators couldn't not take Nokia devices. If you were an operator, if you didn't range the N95, which was the hottest device at the time and the one you took the pictures of the iPhone with when you were in San Francisco at the launch, they would have had a major problem. So there's lots of things.
Nokia continued to have more than 40% of the market for the next couple of years.
They did, they did. The iPhone didn't impact them immediately, and Apple also learned very quickly. So what happened? They launched the phone. They realized it was too expensive. They cut the phone. They immediately started engineering a 3G variant of the phone, and they also then allowed subsidy on the phone. So I don't think there was necessarily a reticence. And also, let's not forget that the operators, some of them were locked out of the iPhone. They couldn't even get it. It was only one operator in each of those, US and UK markets that they had. So I definitely, there were reasons why the operators were making it very difficult for other people, but Apple engineered such a stunning and desirable device that the operators then did have to let them in. So it's a kind of, yes, I agree in some respects, but I think the iPhone on its own was such a disruptive and revolutionary device that it wasn't a question of just the operators letting them in and having an easy ride.
So do you disagree with if Nokia had knocked on AT&T's door with an identical phone to the iPhone, it wouldn't have been kicked out? Not doing 3G?
Not necessarily if it had been identical to the iPhone, but the reality is, Simon, they didn't have an iPhone. They didn't have anything close to an iPhone. They thought Symbian was their future. Oh. And they didn't have the vision to deliver that. So yeah, they had the whatever it was of that called, MIMO or Migo or whatever, but they were still phones that were architected on the premise of a very small, power efficient processor with small little Java applications, rather than this. I remember describing the iPhone at the time as an obese device, ridiculous, massive processor, loads of memory. It was so disruptive. And I think that was the game-changing moment.
And wasn't the other game-changing moment actually not in 2007, but in 2008 when Apple launched the App Store? In fact, until then, it was a shiny, exciting, incredibly niche player, and maybe wasn't disrupting the industry that much. Is that fair?
Well, I mean that is true, but Simon will be rightly, I'm sure, point out that apps had been around for a long time and people had tried to do that. What Apple were able to do by allowing the App Store and allowing apps was deliver apps that were just computer-like apps. So they weren't just little cut down vignette, tiny memory footprint Java apps, which there was the odd game and the odd weather forecasting. It was a really rich, exactly, Snake and more. It was a very rich, compelling experience on a very compelling platform.
So actually where apps did work before iPhone was Japan. The iApply stuff was a big market with, you could buy magazines about apps you could buy. And actually, I think that something where Apple did move the game on was their 30%, because the operators were charging 80% on the scores. So all the fuss between Epic and Apple about 30%, Apple changed the model completely from where the operators were. But you could see all of my arguments about the operators holding everybody else back and not Apple as being a success for Apple. Apple got the operators to think differently about the role of the handset manufacturer.
But I don't think they gave them a free ride, which I think was the premise. What happened was Apple then engineered a situation where the operators became beholden to them. And, if you were an operator, so take, for example, speculation is that Vodafone thought they were going to win the deal to have the iPhone in the UK. I think you may discuss that in the book, Rory. And then eventually, the combination of O2 and Charles Dunstan, and you talk about the Carphone story as well, actually won it. And we still see today in the UK market, more than 10 years after, significantly more than 10 years after, that first to market advantage that O2 have, meaning that they remain an iPhone stronghold. Although which is very interesting.
Where what Simon says seems to me to be completely true is that what happened was a massive shift in the balance of power, and the operators walked into an elephant trap. The operators kind of ruled the roost before Apple, and have struggled ever since to shape their bottom lines in the way that they would want.
Absolutely. And I think, Simon, you'd agree with that. The world's changed, and the operators who used to be able to wield an enormous amount of power with these, specification documents down, with all of this minutiae in them, Apple looked through it and said, we're not doing any of that. We're going to do what we think consumers want. and they built it, and the rest followed.
But for quite a long time after that, the operators still kept all the rules for everybody else, not those rules for Apple.
Yeah. Now I want to move on to your assertion that the iPhone was not the first smartphone, which is obviously true. My assertion is that the iPhone was the first smartphone in the way the Model T Ford was the first car. Obviously, it wasn't the first car, but it launched a whole new era. I'd been mucking around with Scion organizers and the odd borrowed a Nokia communicator and various other smartphones long before 2007, but they were not a mass market proposition, were they?
Okay, no, I can accept that.
No, God, you're not.
No, that's you can't do that, Simon.
Yeah, okay, I accept it.
But I think but actually, what I'll push back on is a lot of the reason for Apple's success wasn't technical competence, but it was fashion.
Yeah,
it was a brand. It was it alternates with Aston Martin for being the most aspirational brand, and there was just so much wrong with the original iPhone.
I know, and I write about that in the book. I did a little video for Steve Jobs, kind of arrogantly saying, "I want this, I want this, I want." It didn't have video. It obviously didn't have 3G. It didn't have it didn't have apps at the beginning. It was missing a whole bunch of stuff. I make the point that for about a year, I was walking around with 3 phones, which was ridiculous. An iPhone, a BlackBerry from my corporate email, that's the other thing I wanted, and a Nokia N95, which shot video.
But things that you wouldn't be immediately obvious to you was the signaling was so bad, the radio that there were crisis talks between the operators and the infrastructure manufacturers saying, how are we going to deal with all this bad traffic on our networks?
On the DNA of the smartphone, Rory, I think it fall to me as with my mobile phone museum project, just to give you a little history there, which is, when we were chatting before we came on air here, Simon was mentioning a product called the Simon, the IBM Simon, which was a product that came out, I think it must have been 94 or something like that. I haven't got off the top of my head. And that was arguably what was the great-great-grandfather of the smartphone as we know it today, a touchscreen device with a cellular radio. The first known reference to smartphone came from Ericsson. They had a concept product called Penelope, which went on to be the R380, which was a Epoch 32 based device, which goes back to your mention of Scion, and that came from there. And then we saw this kind of, journey through various devices, the evolution into Symbian. And I vividly remember, the battles, because I was at Gartner at the time, and we had to kind of define smartphone and how would we define a smartphone. And I remember Mike Lazaridis from BlackBerry having vigorous discussions with us about why BlackBerries should be considered as smartphones. But of course, everything that came before the iPhone really was a poor relative. And yes, they were known as smartphones. There were lots of smartphones previously, but I think the iPhone in consumer consciousness could be regarded as what was the first kind of true iPhone experience, which took us into this world we live in now with Android and others, which offer that compute platform in your hand.
Because to my mind, before the iPhone, all mobile phones of whatever variety were about talking and maybe texting, and the other things were a kind of gimmick. Even the camera on those early phones, and it was after that switch happened, whereby calling and texting became almost incidental.
I challenge you on camera, because I think there were things going on with camera. If you think of Nokia's N series devices, the N95 was part of that, but go earlier, for example, the N90, which was a camcorder type device, the N93, which had the first 3 times optical camera. There was a lot going on with camera. I think mobile phones had already started to displace the digital still camera, but in terms of the all-in-one super powerful device, because I mean, even Apple on camera in the early days, it took them until they got to about iPhone 4 to have something that was competitive. And that goes back to your video for Steve Jobs, which was, I need a decent camera, I need my email and my productivity of the BlackBerry, camera for Nokia, and then I love the smartphone, the iPhone, and we got there. But the idea of using your phone for this multitude of things and it becoming the remote control for your life, which the iPhone became, with apps, with great video experience, with super rich apps that were able to really become useful, all sorts of little things in your lives that you became dependent on. Apple definitely unlocked that potential.
Simon. So there was a person who had that vision, and that was Geoffrey Frost at Motorola. And I went to lots of things where he stood up and talked about the device formerly known as the cell phone, and he was the one who got iTunes into the Rocker. You talk about Rocker in the book, and actually he offered Johnny Ive anything he wanted to come and work for Motorola. So he could have had 3 jets if he wanted to work for Motorola. Absolutely anything.
That's amazing.
And he tried to get Mark Newson to come and work for Motorola. I met Mark Newson at the World Congress, when he was being courted. But I would argue that when Geoffrey died, Motorola died. It was, it really was a turning point for the company, and it's not widely recognised. So at the time, the CEO of Motorola was Ron Garrett, who was ex-army, really tough, and he came to talk to us about how we were going to see it through without Geoffrey, and he just collapsed in the meeting and said, "I don't know, we're not going to."
And what was your personal experience in terms of the devices that you had, Simon? In 2007, 2008, what were you personally using? And
Symbian devices, and actually I really liked Symbian. What broke Symbian was Nokia taking control of it and it becoming seen as, so when Symbian started having different UIs for different manufacturers, when it stopped being Quartz and Crystal and all those UIs, and it became, what was the Sony Ericsson one? UIQ, when it became UIQ and Series 60, and it stopped being a collaborative project, that's when Symbian started to fall apart. Would you agree, Ben?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if we go back to the 2007 question from Rory, the N95 was just the must-have phone. That's what's so incredible. Nokia's N95 had this 5-megapixel camera, built-in GPS. It was this multimedia device. The slider went both ways. You could watch YouTube. But everyone thought that was the future.
You had to tap 5 times or 6 times or something or other to get online.
Exactly, and that was what was wrong. We were living in this bubble, which had been informed by Nokia and some of the others in terms of this is what the phone business is. People like myself were looking at the market, thinking, "My word, this company's got 40% market share." Even if they had a few bad quarters, then the worst that could happen would be a 5% loss. But Steve Jobs and the team at Apple, because all credit to them. There's some great books out there in addition to yours about the story of the iPhone and its development. The Apple modus operandi of kind of saying, we'll worry about what the consumer wants, and we're not going to be listening to all of the noise about what a phone should be, but we're going to design something of what we want it to be, delivered something which was just a game changer. And I'm not sure whether I'll see something like that in my lifetime again. But the mobile phone industry is very cyclical. So, if you look back, there was a time when the Japanese manufacturers are winning. Then there was a time when Ericsson and Motorola were winning, and then Nokia were winning and had seemingly unassailable share. And then Apple.
There's a good point to wrap up on. I mean, let me first put this to Simon. So for the last decade, Apple, and actually we haven't at any stage mentioned Android and Google. The industry's been dominated by Apple and Google. Is that going to change at all, Simon?
There's a danger that we'll see a world that's split between China and the rest of the world, if Harmony starts to get some traction, we'll
Huawei
have,
operating system, yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
But actually, so I want to come back to this bit right at the end of your book. You talk about iPhone 12 and how it really isn't that exciting, and people don't queue around the streets for phones anymore. And wonder if it's Apple's fault that phones have got dull. That phones were really exciting. When I was at What Mobile magazine, I didn't care about the fact that the manufacturer was going to want the phone I had this month back next month, because there'd be an even more exciting one next month, and I was having 3 phones a month. Now, I don't really care what I buy as my next phone. I quite like a Motorola Razr, but that's royalty to Motorola, and I like the mechanics. But I think that most people think that a phone should look like a phone, and a phone looks like an iPhone, and it's all got boring.
Ben, are you bored?
I do feel we have plateaued a little bit, and of course it's a bit like cars or domestic appliances or anything like that. You move to the kind of dominant form factor, and that wins out. Just a footnote on Apple, and then a footnote on the future. Footnote on Apple is where the world is different from when Nokia failed is the fact that Apple has created a business model which is predicated on more than just hardware. So, phone manufacturers traditionally sold you a phone, made a margin on the phone, and then hoped you'd buy another one and they'd make margin on the next one. Apple has engineered a situation where the iPhone is the gift that keeps on giving. And that's all of the ecosystem, as they like to call it, around it. So if you buy even a second-hand iPhone, the chances are you'll be paying Apple something, whether it's an iCloud subscription or an Apple Music subscription or something else. And therefore that lock-in, and then some of the things around it, like the Apple Watch, are all things which I think mean that Apple aren't going anywhere anytime soon. In terms of am I bored? My enthusiasm for mobile phones is boundless. And I can tell you some of the things I'm seeing now with flexible display technology and that next chapter of transforming devices fills me with optimism. And whether they're a solution looking for a problem or the future of mobile phones, I don't know yet, but it's good to see people innovating still.
Well, that's a good moment to wrap up. Ben Wood still massively excited. Simon still very excited about Motorola products. That's the end of our first Always On chat. I hope there'll be more. Thank you for listening.